Welcome today to part 4 of the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In our last bit of the story, we found that Enkidu and Gilgamesh had come home from the forest of cedars, having slain Huwawa, the powerful giant. Born of gods, also a figure of the gods, created by the gods, and protected to some degree by the gods. Nonetheless, they had managed to slay him and begin the process of harvesting giant cedar trees to build the gate for Eouc. One of the great deeds that Eouc would remember long after was the killing of Huwawa by Gilgamesh and his best friend, the wild man, Enkidu. So they came back into the city, joyful heroes. And in this time, Ishtar, the goddess of love, cast her eye once more upon Gilgamesh and decided that he would be the perfect husband for her. And so she invited him to come to her temple, and she met him and she praised him, and then she said, "Will you marry me, Gilgamesh?" And Gilgamesh said to her, "I wonder, Ishtar, what it's like to be the husband of Ishtar. Let me recall for you," he says, "your other husbands, your first husband who gave up his entire life to take your place in the underworld where you were trapped, and he's there yet. Then there was the shepherd who loved you dearly and brought you honey from the hives and sweet lambs for your fires. And what happened to him? You turned him into a wolf. And then there was the horse you fell in love with that you ended up riding and spurring and whipping until he dropped from exhaustion. And then there was the gardener who you fell in love with, that was the gardener in your father's palace, and you married him too, and then you got tired of him and turned him into a mole. And then there was the fine, beautiful, long-feathered bird you wed as husband, and after a while tired of him and struck him with a racket and broke his wings, and he sits crying to this day pitifully, 'Oh my wing, oh my wing.' He said, 'Ishtar, it's dangerous to be your husband. There's no way on earth I would ever marry you, Ishtar.' And then he left. It is said that he slid her like a chair under a table and refused her request. Now, after he left, Ishtar became extremely upset. This was the first time she'd asked any being or person to marry her who had said no, absolutely not. She had been scorned, and she was furious, and she had temper tantrums, and she broke everything in her palace and her temples, and finally went up to heaven to complain to her father Anu, who was one of the main gods of the heavens, and she told him all of her stories, and he said to her, what names did he call you?" "He said I was a shoe that was too tight, Father. He told me about all my other husbands and what happened to them." And the father said, "Well, Ishtar, is any of that true?" "Well, yes, but it's still not fair. He should have married me when I asked him to." Anu said, "I really can't see your point, Ishtar, but I will take you to the council of the gods." So they went to the council of the gods, and Ishtar presented her claim that Gilgamesh should be destroyed because refusing to marry her. And the gods agreed with Anu, her father, and said, "Can't really see your point. It's not right to punish a man for telling the truth." But then Ishtar remembered something else, and she said, "But Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed Huwawa, one of the god-appointed beings on the earth to guard the cedar forest, and surely that is against the law of the gods." And the gods had to agree on that one. They had to agree that killing Huwawa was against the rules, and that Huwawa was ordained and created by the gods, and therefore the penalty for killing Huwawa should be death. And so they decided to go ahead to kill Gilgamesh some way for this deed. Now, Ishtar went back to her father to negotiate how this should happen, and she said to him, Father, Father, I want you to release the bull of heaven to kill Gilgamesh. Maybe Enkidu too. And her father said, not the bull of heaven, Ishtar. It will destroy the entire area of Eouc. The people there are innocent. They didn't have anything to do with this problem. This was only Gilgamesh who spurned you and turned down your request to marry. And Ishtar insisted that the bull of heaven be leashed upon Eouc, and she insisted and insisted, and her father refused and refused, and finally Ishtar said, well, if you will not allow the bull of heaven to go down, then I will go down and unlock the gates of the dead, and I will unleash the dead upon the earth, and the dead will go to Eouc, and they will live among the living, and they will devour and eat the living. And that is the way I'll get my revenge. And her father said, Ishtar, that would be the worst punishment anyone could think of. I will have to release the bull of heaven, as you have insisted, to avoid that. So he did. So Ishtar went back down to watch, and Enkidu and Gilgamesh were happily living in Eouc, and they were happily watching their stone carvings be done on the walls of the great stories, and very, very happily celebrating with all the people. But one day the sky grew oppressive, and the heat of the sky turned red, and the whole area felt like it was being steamed alive. And the people woke up in the morning, and they looked out, and they saw a red sky coming. And they saw in the distance a huge cloud of dust, and there was Ishtar leading the bull of heaven down and across the plains toward Eouc. And Eouc, the people of Eouc came out at all the screaming and crying, and everyone saw that the bull of heaven was coming. And yeah, you can just leave it there. Thank you so much. I've got him by the collar. Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Let's get back to our story. I'm trying to do it on the front porch today. Sorry, it's so beautiful out, isn't it? Just beautiful. Back to our story. Across the plains came the huge bull of heaven. They say he was as large as a whole herd of elephants in one being. His horns were so wide they spanned the sky. They were plated in lapis lazuli, and Ishtar led him to the edge of the Euphrates and then let go. And then he stamped his foot on the ground just once. And when he stamped his foot on the ground, he crushed the ground with his toe, and it cracked open a crevasse so wide that it swallowed 100 young soldiers in a gulp, who went down into the earth. Then he pawed his feet onto the ground, and another huge crevasse opened up, and this time it was so big that it went right through the town of Eouc, and it swallowed up 200 more soldiers. And it also caused the river Euphrates to disappear into the large crack in the earth and flow no more. Then the bull began to prepare to charge the walls of the city, and as he stamped and pawed, the walls of the whole city of Eouc cracked and began to fall, and the homes and people were screaming, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu were watching horrified. And Gilgamesh said, "We must do something, I'll get the sword." And Enkidu jumped from the wall of Eouc and jumped right onto the head of the bull between the horns and grabbed the horns and wrestled the bull and wrestled him and tried to twist his head left and right. And then Gilgamesh joined him, and when Gilgamesh jumped onto the head of the bull of heaven, Enkidu slid down toward the back and slid off the back end and grabbed his tail and pulled on his tail, twisting it this way and that. And Gilgamesh tried to get his balance on the back of the neck of the bull, and finally he drove the sword down into the neck to its hilt, and the beast collapsed and died. The bull of heaven fell into the crevasse that it had made where the Euphrates disappeared, and it is said the water that was remaining turned as red as blood. and then the earth closed over the bull of heaven. Enkidu was lying on the ground behind where the bull had been. He had been injured, an injury to his head. He felt dizzy. He felt weak. Gilgamesh helped him back into the town and into a room and laid him down and took care of him. And for a day or two, it seemed like Enkidu might recover. Began to be less dizzy, and then he developed a fever. And then he developed uh, weakness, such fatigue and exhaustion, and he felt terrible. And it turns out that Ishtar had helped this illness of Enkidu, and realizing that the bull of heaven was dead, the town wasn't ruined, Gilgamesh wasn't killed, and in her revenge, she decided to work magic upon Enkidu and kill Enkidu, who was Gilgamesh's best friend. And this would be her greatest revenge upon Gilgamesh, who scorned her. And so, after a number of days, Gilgamesh was distraught. He was bereft. He was out of his mind with grief as Enkidu grew weaker and weaker, and finally Enkidu died. And Gilgamesh refused to leave the side of his friend for 7 days and 7 nights, and finally they were able to take Enkidu out for burial and a memorial to this wonderful friend of Gilgamesh who had died. But Gilgamesh was unreconciled to this idea. He swore to figure out how to bring back his friend from the gates of death. And that is the end of part 4.